Dungeons and Dragons is a popular board game from company Hasbro. It's a bit more than a board game. It's got an illustrious history over its 50 plus years being played as a fantasy board game where you can imagine yourself as a warrior or a rogue character of sorts, and go fight monsters and get treasure, overcome obstacles with your friends. If you're listening to this podcast, you almost certainly know what Dungeons and Dragons is, at least have a loose idea. But adapting that into a film is a difficult task, right? How do you adapt something that's so tangibly beloved by a very large portion of the world, more popular now than ever before? Dungeons and Dragons is. How do you turn that into something that people want to watch, that's fun and exciting and feels like it reflects the feeling of playing the game, while also sharing the trappings of the fantasy world that people imagine themselves to be in Dungeons and Dragons? It's been tried before. I think 1999 there was a Dungeons and Dragons movie that historically bombed. Never went anywhere. There have been adjacent properties, right? You got Amazes and Monsters back in the day, starring a young Tom Hanks, or even Stranger Things on Netflix, which is very, very openly and honestly taking elements from Hasbro's game and Wizards of the Coast and made things like the Demogorgon into a popular meme in society. But making Dungeons and Dragons into a movie is no easy task, and directors Jonathan Goldstein and John Francis Daley set out to put together a core cast of individual, interesting, charismatic characters led by Chris Pine to become a group of thieves of varying origins, right? You've got Chris Pine, your kind of bard character who's roguish and comes up with plans, very charming. You've got Michelle Rodriguez as your barbarian character. Man, I'm really fumbling through this. I got to get out of this intro. You've got a wonderful cast of individuals we'll talk about in just a minute to become a group of thieves who are set out to steal an ancient talisman and hopefully bring a precious someone back from the dead. The movie is Dungeons and Dragons. Andy, what'd you think?
I had a lot of fun with this. I was really surprised, or I didn't really know what to think. It had one of those kind of middle of the road trailers where there's some fun things, but it could go either way. It could be a fun, enjoyable time, or it could be hot garbage. And luckily, this was on the fun and enjoyable time. We basically get kind of like a heist movie where we got to put together this team of different fantastical creatures, people. They have to work through personal issues as well as fantasy challenges, work their way. They got to get the thing to rescue the person, becoming friends, working through things on their own. And it's fun. There's really good effects. There's good action and adventure. It's really funny. There's a lot of laughs. There's a lot more laughs than I kind of thought. So it rides that careful balance of not being too into the fantasy world. It's not like Game of Thrones level where everyone's very serious and has Shakespearean lines, but it's also not too quippy or too relaxed kind of Marvel has become in the last few years. It hits a good balance. It's got a great cast. Chris Pine's really fun and really funny. I really had a good time.
Christine, hot takes on the D&D movie. What'd you think?
Oh, I loved it. I had a very enjoyable time watching it, just because like Andy said, it's a fantasy heist. If you like heist movies, go watch it. If you like fantasy epic adventures, go watch it. But no, I personally liked it because it hit all of those core things that D&D does for me. So with D&D, when you play just at a table with your friends, it's very much, you think that it's going to be like Lord of the Rings and serious and everybody's going to take everything serious. No, it is a comical adventure with all of your friends at the table, and that's what this movie felt like. It felt like a group of friends just sitting at a table that were playing a game that happened to be this movie. In fact, me and Zach discussed it afterwards that we thought that it was going to meta for a second and we might see people playing the game, but no, it plays itself straight. It knows that it's a Dungeons Dragons movie. It knows the history of Dungeons Dragons, and it plays as a comical, fun fantasy adventure with a couple of errors in there that make it a fun movie to go see.
Yeah, I think it's got like all of the elements that make a good like summer fantasy adventure
Hmm.
blockbuster, right? You've got big set pieces like with large fantasy ideals, right? Like big towering cities and larger than life characters and magical artifacts and dungeons and a dragon and like
Yeah.
weapons and fighting. Like it's got all the things it needs to have visually. You have a great cast of characters. Chris, I was getting into a couple of them earlier. I got it up on IMDb. Chris Pine, Michelle Rodriguez, Regé-Jean Page from Bridgerton, Justice Smith, Sophia Lillis, Hugh Grant is in this movie. It's got a sense of humor. It's got action. It's got adventure. But like most importantly, I think the thing that really makes this movie work on at its core is its script. It's
Hmm.
written by directors Jonathan Goldstein and John Francis Daley, who may not sound particularly familiar. One of them is an actor. John Francis Daley was on Freaks and Geeks, and like you probably know him from Bones. He was one of the assistants on that for like years. But in his writing with partner Jonathan Goldstein, they've written features like Horrible Bosses and Horrible Bosses 2, Game Night in 2018, which got some cult acclaim. Spider-Man Homecoming is their biggest feature. They wrote that movie. So they've definitely got like some comedy chops, and they're pretty good at telling a story with like characters that are, relatively likable, I think. And this is no different. Like, I think this movie works at its best because it's humored by like the world that it's in. It doesn't actually step outside of that. Like Christine said, I wondered at one point if it was going to be like he's gonna do like the Lego movie gag, or he's gonna pull out of the world and be like, oh, it's really a group of people sitting around a table
Playing,
playing
right?
Dungeons and right, or like Jumanji, but it never does that. Like it never, well, I guess I just said it doesn't. I probably should have said avoided that as a spoiler, but it's fine. It never takes the time to be like, oh, this is really a game. Like it lives in the world it's in, and our characters, much like the Ghostbusters of all people, like they're goofballs. Like our core cast of like thieves are all goofballs, but everybody else in the world plays it straight. Like the world they live in is accurate, and this is just really how things are, right? Like this mystical land full of people and villagers and royalties and kings and dead people and mages and sorcerers. The world of Dungeons and Dragons is like very rich, and I like that not only is there a lot of it, but there's notably interesting characters along the way. A paladin they run into, or a battlefield where they raise soldiers from the dead to ask them questions. Like all of that helps it feel like grand and epic, and I think that stuff worked really good.
I think part of what works really well is it doesn't require a lot of homework. This is a big issue that Marvel's really started to get into now, is that you kind of have to have watched all, if half to all of the Marvel films to kind of know what's going on. And because characters will show up from other movies or plots from that are continuing, and it can be really hard for new people to get into. And Dungeons and Dragons does a really great job of just throwing you in the world, and you just know what's going on. You're like, these are the good guys, these are our bad guys, these are our conflict, these are kind of rules of our universe, these are the challenges and conflicts, and you can just step right in and know where you are, and it doesn't get too in the weeds and the lore of Dungeons and Dragons, like something like Game of Thrones kind of does, that it's difficult to get into. So like it's very, very accessible.
Yeah. And I think one of the ways like it's so accessible is the characters. Like Chris Pine is incredibly charismatic as our lead Edgin. He just oozes charisma. Like you're just constantly kind of interested in what he's doing. And those backstory is a little fuller than I probably expected. I kind of figured he'd just be kind of a loner, and he's actually got a bit of an interesting something to him. He's partnered with Holga, played by Michelle Rodriguez, who's this like brutish kind of take no nonsense barbarian, perfect for Michelle Rodriguez to play, right? Like this, not really thinking anything's particularly funny, not taking no shit from nobody. Like great. They've got Justice Smith, who's this young up and coming sorcerer who's functionally just pretty bad at magic. Like he's not very good, and he's a bit of a loser. Like and everybody kind of knows it. But Chris Pine like constantly believes in him. Yeah.
Justice Smith is the Michael Cera of this younger generation. He's like that awkward wet blanket with the heart of gold who meets. And he's that same character in every movie. He's just like that like terrified person who you kind of still need on the team.
He was that in Jurassic World Dominion, and then they like barely used him in the last Jurassic World movie because like he I don't know. I guess they couldn't work him in, but he's back kind of doing the same thing. And Sophia Lillis is Doric, a druid character who can turn into animals at will. Something that I think is used effectively, though Sophia Lillis is she plays her character real close to the chest. But between the four of them, I think you get like a lot of good exchanges. And kind of just delightful time. They face off against Hugh Grant's character, who used to be a party member named Forge, who's since gone on to do some kind of nefarious things. But Grant is playing it big as a villain. He's doing like the Paddington 2 thing, which is fantastic. Like it's exactly the tone he needs to have to play like a goofy, over the top kind of comedy villain that doesn't actually do all that much action because he's Hugh Grant, right? They're not going to have him like flipping over boxes or sword fighting. Lots of charm, like oozes charm, and that's exactly what he needs to have. Christine, hot takes on our cast.
Oh, I love the cast. Everybody plays it so well. You mentioned backstories, which did make me laugh because that is a classic thing that many D&D players do is they create very elaborate backstories for their characters. So it was very nice to like have those kind of inserted into the story at random. We have some who have very, very little backstory. We get one or two lines. We have others like our main character, Edgin, who gets a whole monologue on what his backstory is. So it is fun to kind of see that play out and to see how it interconnects with the story and how I keep bringing it back, but they treat it almost like an actual like D&D campaign, which is incredibly fun for somebody who plays D&D and knows D&D, that it recalls back to what you do at the table naturally.
Right. There will be moments where our characters have like very triumphant victories and also like embarrassingly sad losses.
Your nat 20s and your nat 1 rolls.
Yeah, like reflects the idea of rolling a high number in the game and doing well versus like rolling low and doing like horrifically poor. And that makes for like good comedy moments. That loosens it up. Additionally, like there's just that right level of snark. Like from all of our characters, they're just sarcastic enough to give each other a hard time and a bit of an elbow ribbing, but nothing like overly mean, which I think is perfect for a party of individuals.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Andy,
do you know what this reminded me a lot of? That
What's
I think
that?
this might be kind of mapped after is the Wizard of Oz. 'Cause
Okay.
you have your four main characters who are all kind of searching for heart, home, courage, brains. And then you have Forge's character is kind of the wizard, the man behind the curtain. It's not 1-to-1, but it reminded me a lot of that.
Yeah. I like your comparison of like immediate characteristics for your party. Like I said, I thought of it like Ghostbusters and Chris Pine's Peter Venkman, like who's just kind of like, yeah, I come up with a plan, but like never really has anything tangible to offer. But he's like the charisma, right? Like I really got a kick out of that. And I also compared it to of all things, Snakes on a Plane, which sounds silly, but hear me out. Snakes on a Plane is a movie that like pretty much plays it straight. They never have anybody look and wink at the camera. They expect the audience to get the joke that like, you're watching a movie called Snakes on a Plane, right? And like, they don't need to show you that on screen. They can just like, you can feel it as you watch it. And like Dungeons and Dragons Honor Among Thieves walks that line perfect. Like it lets you know that like, hey, this is a joke, right? And we're all getting kind of a laugh out of this. And we're here to have a fun time at the movies. And like in that way, similar to like John Wick, like it undeniably is a fun time at the movies. Like it's a little silly what you're watching, but you know that going in. Like, you knew that when you bought the ticket, I don't think anybody expects it to be Return of the King. And it's not trying to be. Like it's just trying to be a fun 2 hours, which for the most part it does, although it does feel a little long at a couple points.
It does kind of begin to stretch out a little bit in the second act. It is 2 hours and 15 minutes. It feels about 15 minutes too long. And it turns into a little bit of a fetch quest. You got to do A before you can do B. And then you got to do, well, we actually need to do C before we can do B. And it does that a little bit, which I think is probably in the spirit of what you do in the game. You go through various dungeons. But it does get a little long in the tooth, but just in the second act.
Christine, before we wrap up, I wanted to ask about like kind of some direct comparisons to the game. I know people have said there's a lot of Easter eggs that come from the game that like Andy and I probably missed. I mean, any you want to share without giving anything away? I don't know. What do you think?
So if you've seen the trailers, you've seen, and you are a hardcore D&D fan, you've seen a lot of the thing. Like obviously there's a dragon. There are a couple of other like creatures and beasts that you might see. In one of the trailers, there's a mimic, which is basically like a box that's a monster, really. But some of my favorite things that I think when I caught them, I was very proud of myself for catching them. Were things. There is a Critical Role, which is a big like D&D channel essentially where a bunch of voice actors get together and they play in real life. It's huge within the D&D community, but there's a Critical Role reference at one point in time that Justice Smith's character does right towards his introduction. So just Critical Role fans, keep your ear out for that. Justice Smith's character also carries around a bag of holding. He is constantly being like handed things, and Edgin constantly hold this, take this, and they're being handed to Justice Smith, and you're like, they're big things that Justice is having to hold, and so he's just putting them seemingly nowhere because they just sort of disappear from his person. But if you catch when they're running at any point in time or when there's kind of a party wide shot, he definitely has a bag of holding on his hip, which is kind of a nice little like, there it is. And another really fun part, without getting into spoilers, there is that classic puzzle feature that at one point in time, one of the characters kind of is like, we have to only go on the odd steps, and then you have to move laterally, and then you have to go backwards and retrace your steps so they're only even steps, and then move laterally. And that's very much like at the table you're trying to figure out these things because your dungeon master is going to throw puzzles at you. So that was a really funny scene where I was just like, as a player, I would be very frustrated with this puzzle, and the way that the movie solves it is very funny. So those are some of my favorite little Easter eggs to watch out for. But obviously, there's a lot more if you're a big hardcore fan, and I hope you catch them all. There's like 38.
That actually reminds me of like this really charming element in the D&D movie where our characters will like suggest ways to solve a problem, and some of the suggestions are like completely off the wall. Right? Others will be like really clever and like in a way that's so clever like nobody would ever think to go that way, and like that is very much reflective of like solutions at the table. And somebody's like, well, how are we going to steal this bag of gold from this lord? Well, we could rob him in the night, or we could sneak into his place and take it, or we could plan a little heist and get it from like that actually makes for a really fun time and gives your characters like a lot of room and creative space to grow. I think is like lift them off the screen and make them a little larger than life. And like ultimately that's something this movie does really well. Like it makes everybody feel big. It makes the world feel surprisingly like robust. You could totally see them making another one of these, like in the same vein, same world, same sense of humor. Like I think Jonathan Goldstein, John Francis Daley may have cracked the code a bit on like what kind of cinematic voice and audiences. This might be the way to go. Any other thoughts?
I think I'm ready.
Yeah, no.
Before we wrap this say we probably got it all. Andy?
I would definitely recommend this to most people, friends and family of all ages. It's a lot of fun. There's good performances. It's funny. It's lighthearted. It's both. It strikes a good balance where it's not too serious or also too lame or just too casual. Very accessible. And I was thinking about this, with family films being out right now. The other big one is Shazam, but I would much rather take people to see this than to watch Shazam: Fury of the Gods. So highly recommend.
Christine, would you recommend the D&D movie?
Rolls a natural 20 in my eyes. So
wow,
look at that!
I love that.
She's a natural.
Boy, yeah, you should have been podcasting with us since day one. Perfect. You should start your own show. I would say the same. I think the D&D movie is like surprisingly fun. I was definitely skeptical. I think the first time I saw a trailer, I was like, I don't know. It seems a little ham-fisted. But come trailer 2, I was a bit more charmed, and I'm pleased to say that like it is better than it looks. Like the D&D movie is surprisingly fun. Take it easy, kick back, relax with a bucket of popcorn. and watch Dungeons and Dragons: Honor Among Thieves. With that, we need to move into our next segment. Normally, this is where we talk about what's killing cinema or some upcoming trailers.